Okay, sixth graders, follow along as I read out loud chapter one. Make sure that you are filling out your graphic organizer as we go. Brian Robeson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13 and the only passenger on the plane with a pilot named, what was it? Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In feet since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had spoken only 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot's seat, which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last of the conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all of the controls right there in front of him, all of the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. But in 5 minutes, they had leveled off at 6,000 feet and headed northwest. And from then on, the pilot had been silent, staring out the front, and the drone of the engine had been all that was left. The drone and the sea of green trees that lay before the plane's nose and flowed to the horizon, spread with lakes, swamps, and wandering streams and rivers. Now Brian sat looking out at the window with the roar thundering through his ears and tried to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. The thinking started. It always started with a single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling. Lawyers, God, he thought how he hated lawyers who sat in their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he lived in was coming apart. And the breaking and shattering of all of the solid things. His home, his life, all the solid things. Divorce. A breaking word, an ugly breaking word, divorce. Secrets. No, not secrets so much as just the secret. What he knew, he had not told anybody. What he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. What he knew, the secret. Divorce, the secret. Brian felt his eyes beginning to bum, and he knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eyes burned and tears came, the seeping tears that burned, but he didn't cry. He wiped his eyes with a finger and looked at the pilot out of the corner of his eye to make sure he hadn't noticed the burning and tears. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw dials, switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles that were wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing that he understood. And the pilot seemed the same way. Part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit and he smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. He had never been in any kind of plane, never seen the cockpit of a plane except in films or on television. It was loud and confusing. First time. It's not as complicated as it looks. Good plane like this almost flies itself. The pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls, your feet on the rudder pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I'd better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slewed suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her light, take her light. Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibration of the plane came through the wheel and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of the wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly and the plane immediately banked to the right. And when he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. So right now, we are seeing that the pilot is letting Brian take a chance at trying out flying the plane for himself. Let's see what happens. Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled, at least this part. The pilot nodded. All of flying is easy. It just takes learning, like everything else. Like everything else. He took the controls back, then reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window at the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but memories did, came flooding in. The words, always the words. Divorce, the secret, fights, split. The big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother, except for the summers and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated the judges as he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned over the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges who did not know what had really happened. Judges with the caring look that meant nothing, as lawyers said legal phrases that meant nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father. In the school year, with his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk. Talk. Words. Now the plane lurched slightly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned back to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some discomfort. Must have some stomach troubles. So this first summer when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with the divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed or invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forest ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane next to a fabric bag the pilot had called a survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing. That had to be specially made in the city, riding in a bush plane with a pilot named Jim or Jake or something, who had turned out to be an all right guy, letting him fly and all. Except for the smell. There was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot, found him rubbing the shoulder, down the arm, now to the left arm, letting go more gas and wincing. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. His mother had driven him from the city to meet the plane at Hampton, where it came to pick up the drilling equipment. A drive in silence. A long drive in silence, 2.5 hours of sitting in the car, staring out the window, just as he was now staring out the window of the plane. Once, after an hour when they were out of the city, she turned to him. Look, can't we just talk this over? Can't we talk this out? Can't you tell me what's bothering you? And there were the words again. Divorce, split, the secret. How could he tell her what he knew? So he had remained silent, shook his head and continued to stare unseeing at the countryside. And his mother had gone back to driving, only to speak to him one more time when they were close to Hampton. She reached over the back of the seat and brought up a paper sack. I got something for you, for the trip. So everyone pause right here. Make sure that you filled in whatever you think was a really important event we learned about, or any of the 5 W's of a summary. Go ahead and do that right now, and then once you've done it, go back to the website and click on the second link.